Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining today's event. Indeed, for us here in Berlin, is a very, very warm welcome as it is the hottest day of the year yet. My name is Andrea Steinke, and I'm a research fellow at the Center for Humanitarian Action, specializing on the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, the so-called triple nexus, and I will be facilitating the next 90 minutes of talk and discussion. This event is a collaboration between the Center for Humanitarian Action and the International Committee of the Red Cross. The occasion of this event is the publication of the report Joining Forces to Combat Protracted Crisis, Humanitarian and Development Support for Water and Sanitation Providers in the Middle East and North Africa, authored by the World Bank, ICRC and UNICEF. Before we start the discussion, some thoughts on structure and housekeeping. This event will be recorded, as you have noted probably already, and made available after the event. We will start off with a short introduction presentation of the report, followed by a short video impression from Syria. The panel discussion will then take the conclusions and the recommendations, the insights of the report further. After that, we will open the discussion to the audience. Feel free and feel very encouraged to post comments and questions in the chat. My colleague Sonja Hövelmann will monitor the chat and feed questions and comments in the discussion later. For transparency reasons, prior to the event, we have been contacted by water and sanitation experts from Médecins Sans Frontières who would like to contribute their humanitarian perspectives to the findings of the report. They will do so after the panel and as an introduction to the audience discussion. So to discuss the report, its implications and way forward, we have a range of distinguished guests here with us today that I will briefly introduce now and properly introduce upon their first appearance. Dominick Revell of the World Bank, Mohammad Hmaidi of the Water Sector Regulatory Council in Palestine, Michael Talhami of the ICRC, Rodrigo Mena of the Institute of Social Studies in Rotterdam, and Khaled Shalak of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. As you might have noticed, we have an all-male panel today. Unfortunately, one participant had to cancel last week, but as with so many other societal aspects of inequality, those situations are not mere effects of individual shortcomings, but expressions of larger structures. So often it's hard to balance all aspects in an intersectional way. We will do our best to be better and to do better in the future, and maybe let's all work towards overcoming those structural limitations in our interventions, but also in our own institutions. So nevertheless, I'm immensely grateful to be joined by such a great round of very distinguished experts, and I'm looking forward to an interesting and inspiring discussion today. So let's start off with the report. It centers around the prominence of water and sanitation infrastructure for all aspects of livelihood and human well-being. Using insights from 7 contexts: Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Palestine, and Jordan. It shows that more often than not, it's the secondary consequences of crisis that are more severe than the effects of violence itself. So to further introduce the report, I would now like to invite Dominick Revell on the stage. Dominick has worked across countries in Africa and the Middle East on a combination of lending and economic analysis, covering water's multiple roles in agriculture, health, urban development, and environmental protection. Since joining the bank in 2007, he has led reviews of water sector financing, public expenditure, poverty targeting, and tackling water insecurity, often with the theme of strengthening country system of service delivery. He has a Master's of Science in Public Policy and Management from SOAS, as well as degrees in Agriculture from Waal College, University of London, and Microbiology from the University of Warwick. Very impressive CV already, and very diverse, I would say. Please, Dominick, we are very happy to have you kick us off with the introduction to the report.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for the introduction. Can I just make sure you can hear me fine? Great. Hello, everybody. It's a delight to be here today and to join you for this session and to introduce this report, which the genesis of which is really from practitioners. So some of the authors are here, but also some of the practitioners like Mohammad are here with us today. And I really want to emphasize this practical aspect. It started with a dialogue back in 2017 with utility managers from across the Middle East and North Africa. And its focus is very much on the urban protracted crises that we've been seeing in the Middle East. So the key idea, if you like, the basis around this is that there are culpabilities, if you like, in the run-up to crises, as well as things that have to be done within crises. And so I start this presentation with this idea that prior to the Arab Spring in 2011, over the prior 20 years, there was this incredibly rapid expansion of infrastructure across Mena. And it was done in an economic context distorted by subsidies and potentially lacking some accountability. So just for example, it's very difficult to get a lot of the financial stats on many of the utilities across the region, even still today. It's patchy. But the important point here is that there was near universal access to infrastructure, but services was more shaky. And this idea I'm going to come back to a lot, is that we need to be able to read the signs of vulnerability up front. Then, of course, there's the idea of crisis upon crisis. And that I think we're all familiar with in this group. And I'm not going to go into in any more detail than that. But because the third point on this slide is really key, that the idea of protracted crisis, as the group of practitioners who were involved in developing this report found, really transcends the conventional notions of pre, during, and post-crisis. In fact, I think that some of us would argue that there is in fact even no obvious path of return from some of these protracted crises. So this idea is captured in this slide, that we have an old problem, which are the development challenges, the problem of growing populations, low cost recovery, increasing water scarcity, high levels of non-revenue water, that predate effectively some of the bigger crises that we're going to talk about. And then we have the new problems, the destruction of infrastructure, the mass movements of people, the tensions between communities, host and migrant, energy shortages, etc. And the response needs to be both by development and humanitarian actors, addressing both the old problem and the new problem simultaneously. That's the basic premise and concept, if you like, behind this. Now, we got very practical after that. We were working with utility managers and practitioners, as I said, and so we looked at what the situation was pre-crisis, managing services during crisis, and how to stem the rate of decline. Note that the relatively low bar, it's not about any magic, it's about just stemming the rate of decline. And we looked at this across 5 key problems, the problems that utility managers wanted to talk to us about, and that there seemed such a huge amount of experience around in the room. The first one, inadequately governed water resources. This goes to both quantity and quality. I'll get into those in a minute. But it also, the second aspect is aggressive competition from alternative providers. The best and most obvious form that we're all familiar with is tanker supplied water. The third then is the paralysis of high-tech facilities. And here the issue is, when we build these high-tech facilities, have we really thought about the consequences? The fourth is about escalating energy costs during protracted crisis. And the fifth, and actually one that people, practitioners and utility managers really wanted to talk about, was the cash flow crunch. Okay, so let me get into these, starting with the inadequately governed water resources. the key here is that before crises, a lot of signs were being ignored. For example, in Gaza, the water quality problem has been known and it's been discussed, but it wasn't resolved. And so as the protracted crisis has moved on, this has just got worse and worse. And within the crises, then the managing during crisis, you get into a situation where you basically lose control for a period. And that can be more of a quantity problem, but also a quality problem, like the Aleppo aquifer when the Al Hafsa plant got cut off. Now, in pre-crisis, what we really want to ensure is that utilities have access to more than one source of water, but also that we really begin to address this question of water quality. And one of the things that I think we need to all get better at is just publishing the data that we have on water quality. Now, that is because whatever systems are set up at whatever time, it's likely that the systems for monitoring water quality and water quantity break down, but usually the scientific record is maintained. So that's a key idea we want to get across here. Competition from alternative service providers. The signs of this are really quite obvious prior to crises. I mean, it was pretty obvious already from 1995 onwards that tankers were becoming a more regular form of service delivery, say, in Syria. And so we need to get better at reading, but then also putting that competition in check and asking questions. Why is it that utilities aren't able to keep market share? Why is it that their market share, if you like, is being eroded by alternative provision? And in some really extreme cases like Basra, we now see that 90% of households use tanker supplies or alternative supplies. So pre-crisis, we really need to get better at reading these signals. We need to plan exit strategies when we're in a crisis, and we need to think about standby financing to support business continuity and to help utilities win back market share. High-tech wastewater treatment plants, but they can be desalination plants as well. The point here is that anything high-tech is likely to fall over during a crisis. And I found a very interesting dialogue that I've had with Michael is around the different approaches that ICRC took in Rafah to the approach that the World Bank took in North Gaza. And I think that there needs to be much more dialogue around the types of wastewater treatment plants that are designed when things are relatively stable, so that we really understand and think through the consequences of later problems. Escalating energy costs. This is not just about an electricity bill or the energy costs escalating during a crisis. It's the fact that there are a lot of hidden subsidies in the system. So utilities are set up, they're literally hardwired into a subsidy system for energy. That is an energy system which is highly subsidized. And when they get into the crisis, the subsidies literally evaporate. Yemen is a great example of this. And they have to go to high-speed diesel generation. And we all understand the consequences of this. So we really, pre-crisis, need to think about what can be done upfront, what can be done better in order to provide renewable energy solutions, but also just make sure that we understand the real costs of energy. And all of these four things that I've mentioned before really come to this point of cash flow crunch, because as crisis hits, the subsidies evaporate, the tariff revenue goes down, and the expenditure goes up. And this is what all the utility managers said hurt them most. And yet, pre-crisis, if we had better accounting information and we actually made a better analysis of it, we would be able to see a lot of these problems up front. And there are perhaps things that we could do also around ring-fencing finance. So in sum, there's a lot of hard work to build resilience that actually needs to be done in advance of crisis. And we're going to have a bit of a discussion about this, because the question is, what is advance of crisis? Protracted crisis is a complex thing. And so the idea here is that if you're not literally firefighting at the moment, you need to be doing something about resilience. The second point is that the central responsibility for building resilience is with the water service providers and their governments. But development and humanitarian actors, let's just say the international community, have a genuine need to look at the risks of what is happening in countries, because a lot of it bounces back if we get it wrong. And in that idea, with that idea in mind, we want both humanitarian actors to spend more time with development actors in at-risk stable settings, if you like, but we also then need this perhaps more commonly discussed dialogue, which is the shift from humanitarian to development actions in the early recovery phase. So we feel that a number of the precautions, a number of these signs that I've discussed, that are discussed in this report, if we understood them better and we got better at actually acting on them, they would be a set of precautions, or there could be a set of precautions to better protect water service provision and sanitation provision, and that we could use those and build on those to come with a global set of agreements. Thank you very much. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Dominic, for pointing out the key recommendations and findings of the report. We will now switch to a short video presentation to illustrate what this actually means in practice. It's a short video input from Syria given by engineer Khaled Shalak. He's a technical advisor with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent movement in the Water and Rehabilitation Department. Prior to that, he was the Deputy General Director of the Damascus Water Supply and Sewage Authority from 1980 to 2017, which is basically mainly 40 years, so it's a very long time span. He was one of the key actors and decision makers among the service providers trying to ensure the continuity in the delivery of water and sanitation during the protracted crisis in Syria. So,
hello everybody, I am Khaled Shalak. I work currently for Syrian Arab Red Crescent as WASH Technical Advisor. Formerly, I worked for Damascus Public Water Service Provider for more than 37 years. My last position was Deputy General Director. I would like to take this opportunity to give you just a briefing on the difficulties of ensuring the delivery of WASH services during the protracted crisis of Syria by dividing it into 3 time phases. First phase till 2010, pre-crisis water WASH situation. The Syrian public WASH services provider were supported and encouraged by the government, while the international funding agencies contributed in implementing selected projects for developing the Syrian WASH sector. But planning effort on the development of the sector were very limited. Sector figure: total 2010 drinking water consumption in Syria was 1.3 billion cubic meter. Total customer number 3.4 million. Service coverage 94% for urban area and 65% for rural area. Planned average water demand 150 liters per capita per day. Big cities in Syria like Aleppo adopted high vulnerability centralized water supply system. For example, Al-Khafsa water supply system supply water to 3 million inhabitants. Concerning wastewater treatment plant, more than 110 stations were in service or under construction. The international funding agencies allocated millions of dollars supporting WASH sector project through many contributions provided by JICA, KfW, EIB, and others. In terms of electric energy, the 2010 production capacity reached 10 gigawatt hour. As example on budgets and cash flow, in 2010, Damascus Water Establishment produced 310 million cubic meter, with total customer number 1.1 million. The total employees number was 4,200. The operation budget was $50 million. The revenue was $47 million. The investment budget was $68 million. Second phase, from 2011 to 2020, during crisis wash situation, huge dynamic condition and sanction action faced wash services. This affected badly service provider performances and capabilities and caused more humanitarian suffering for the people and jeopardized the public health. The humanitarian organization had wide contribution in supporting wash sector. They exerted very big effort to cope with the escalation of the variety of needs in types and scale. Most important problems that face the wash service provider were unpredicted movement of IDPs, hard to reach area accessibility, damage and lack of qualified staff, lack of power and transportation, looting and sabotage of water meters. Sector figures: more than 1.5 million water meters were damaged or looted. In terms of wastewater treatment plant, only 39 stations still in operation with poor efficiency, while 72 stations damaged or not completed. The electric energy production in 2020 was decreased to 3 gigawatt hour with 4 to 8 hour supply per day. The total 2020 drinking water production decreased to around 800 million cubic meter per year. As an example, on budget and cash flow, in 2020, Damascus Water Establishment employees number decreased to 3,100. The production water quantity decreased to 188 million cubic meter. The operation budget reduced to $5.6 million. The revenue decreased to $3 million. The investment budget reduced to $5.4 million. ICRC and UNICEF and other humanitarian organization contribution for Damascus was $4.8 million. Third phase, after 2020, vision on wash needs. It is very essential to keep influenced and aged wash facilities in operation by stabilizing the service through partly rehabilitation intervention, like aged Al-Khafsa Aleppo water supply, which costs $7.5 million out of $50 million for all rehabilitation. The humanitarian organization support in implementing rehabilitation project is very important to continue. Structural support of the water service providers focusing on the capacity building and training of the wash sector staff and operators have priority. Provision of equipment and spare parts and measuring instrument is needed. The rehabilitation of water quality and monitoring facilities is very important. Supporting the rehabilitation projects of the wastewater treatment plant is needed. For example, the rehabilitation of Damascus wastewater treatment plant estimated cost is $50 million. while in Aleppo wastewater treatment plant estimated cost is $200 million. Focusing on addressing the renewable energy component in the coming WASH rehabilitation project is important. Supporting the metering system rehabilitation is needed for cash flow improvement. At the end, thank you very much for your kind attention, and bye-bye.
In absence, thank you very much to Khaled Shalak for this, for pointing out those very important facts from the ground, needs and challenges of water and sanitation provision in crisis-affected communities and contexts. So let's now open the panel, start the panel. I will introduce each panelist up on his first appearance. The first round of this 30-minute session will be used to present each speaker's unique perspective on the matter, followed by 2 more rounds of engaged discussions surrounding specific topics. So we will start with Michael. Michael Talhami is an urban services advisor for habitat and water questions at the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. Previously, Michael was the ICRC's regional water and habitat advisor to the Near and Middle East, where he provided multidisciplinary analysis of the combined effects on vulnerable communities of conflict and water and environmental issues. So he has also held consultancies with a GIZ and the UNDP in the Middle East and several international advisory firms. Following a career as an environmental engineer in Canada, US, and parts of Oceania, and managing pipeline leak detection projects, environmental site assessments, and soil and groundwater remediation and reclamation projects. So from profession, Michael holds also a master's in environment and development with a specialization in water and resource and water policy, in addition to a bachelor in environmental engineering. So please, Michael, go ahead. The stage is yours.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to focus my remarks on 3 main points. 1, to highlight the operational challenges that necessitate a stronger humanitarian development collaboration. Secondly, to outline what a development-leaning intervention, as Dominick had mentioned, actually looks like when a humanitarian actor is engaged. And 3, give a few practical examples of the humanitarian development nexus in practice that maybe go beyond what you can actually see in the report. So first and foremost, the operational challenges, what we're often confronted with, in particular when we're looking at not only urban warfare settings, but as the report addresses, it also looks at protracted refugee settings that are primarily focused on host communities that have a large and rapid influx of refugees, and where a bulk of the humanitarian support is primarily in camps, and yet there's significant needs by service providers to ensure access to people. And so the scale and the impact of the consequences of these protracted crises is one thing that makes it extremely difficult for humanitarian organizations alone to be able to respond adequately and at scale. Secondly, the complexity of urban systems and the interconnectedness of urban systems, water, wastewater, electricity, as well as those services that then extend to healthcare, schools, and other critical infrastructure sectors, requires a different approach in terms of how we engage, and different expertise in terms of the rosters that we develop. And third, the duration of the crises. If you look at ICRC as an example, if you look at our top 10 operations today, on average, we've been in those crises for 43 years. And so instead of simply looking at annual responses, we need to push further to have longer term, more foreseeable responses that reinforce the ability to respond to acute emergencies that regularly happen in protracted crises. And one of the reasons we say this is because in protracted urban contexts, we know all too well that it's simply not possible to only rely on traditional humanitarian responses. You cannot simply water truck for 2 million people year in and year out for prolonged periods of time. And and expect that the public health of the population will be safeguarded, to expect that displacement will be mitigated, and rather we use infrastructure as the vehicle to reach the broadest part of the population. This is also important to realize that most emergency responses, like water trucking in urban areas, require an intact water supply system in the first place. And so it begs the question, when humanitarian actors are going to more consistently develop longer term support to service providers to prevent the collapse of systems and to reinforce the ability to respond to acute emergencies. The longer term approach is something that the ICRC and UNICEF have invested in over decades now, as well as a number of other humanitarian actors. It's also something that's highlighted in the report in terms of the case studies and the examples that are brought forward in the report. But I'd like to take a moment just to unpack a little bit the overall approach when supporting service providers. And so it's not enough just to focus on the infrastructure, which typically looks at the repair and the rehabilitation of infrastructure, limited rehabilitation works, what's allowed or doable during a protracted conflict setting. But it's also a necessity to ensure the access to spare parts and consumables, something that in a conflict like Syria that has spanned over the course of the last 10 years, year in and year out, there's a significant logistical challenge and procurement challenge in ensuring access to the chemical consumables to ensure the safe delivery of water. It's also a challenge in terms of the sanctions that are placed on countries and the impacts, potentially unintended impacts on, for instance, the water, wastewater, and electrical sectors. Besides that, we also have to think of the brain drain that is actually on people and personnel for these service providers. And so we need to be more forthcoming with training and capacity building and help develop emergency preparedness plans, which, as Dominick had mentioned, often haven't been developed prior to the onset of crisis. All of this is not to maintain services at pre-crisis levels. It would be simply not realistic. It's much more about stemming the rate of service decline, which is something that Dominick had very clearly mentioned. Having this intimate understanding of the systems developed over decades and working with local actors, primarily service providers, different line ministries, provides humanitarian organizations with specific and very intimate knowledge of these systems that can be useful pre-crisis, as the presentation up front and as the report suggests, in terms of being able to look at systems and instead of focusing only on the development of systems in a way that ensures the broadest coverage area or extending services to people, that it also develops resilient systems to the onset of crises. And there, it's not that we're saying that conflict is necessarily foreseeable. What we are saying is that there's a number of commonalities between resilience building measures to a whole host of different hazards. So taking an all hazards approach will definitely serve services and systems to be more resilient to the onset of conflict as well. We can see this very much in terms of Aleppo, and as Engineer Khaled had very clearly said, in terms of this single point of failure that we see at the Al Hafsa facility that rests over 80 kilometers away from Aleppo, and 3 million people rely on that supply of water. And if it fails, there's no adequate backup. So resilience building measures are something that need to be thought of prior to crisis if they are to support at scale. Secondly, building back as was is simply not an option. If we look at Gaza and consecutive rounds of hostilities, often these large capital projects are the first ones to fail each time. And hence resilience building measures into building back better is exactly what is required. And finally, just to highlight a few examples that go maybe beyond or outside of the Middle East and North Africa focus of the Joining Forces report, but still remain in line with the recommendations of the report. We can look at situations, for instance, like Juba and the Gumbo area of Juba, where the ICRC has made significant investments in the development of infrastructure to extend services to unserved areas that not only serve the host community, but also a number of IDPs that are residing in that host community. And what we've been able to do is we've been able to leverage the comparative advantage of a development actor, in this case GIZ, to be able to sign on to the capacity building efforts of the service provider. And so there's no financial transaction with the ICRC per se, but what there is we can ensure a more reliable supply through leveraging that comparative advantage of a development actor to be able to provide that capacity building and ensure a sense of sustainability of both investments. Secondly, we can look at situations like Marawi in the Philippines, and a broad restoration plan that was put together by the ICRC with the use of different consultants provided short, medium, and long-term recommendations that allowed for investment confidence in that case with the Asian Development Bank to basically come in after the ICRC had done the short and medium-term restoration with the service provider. The longer-term, more transformational reconstruction will be taken over by the Asian Development Bank. But that planning up front was what allowed them to come in much faster and much earlier. I'll leave my remarks at that, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Before moving on, I would like to point out again that we have a chat going on, and if there are any comments and questions already, please feel encouraged to post your questions in the chat. My colleague Sonja Hövelmann will monitor them and feed them into the discussion later. If there are any technical issues, please don't hesitate to write a direct message to CHA Technical Support. So I'm very honored and excited to invite Mohammad Hmaidi to the stage. He is the CEO of the Water Sector Regulatory Council in Palestine. He's a graduate of the University of Loughborough, UK, in water and waste engineering for development countries. Previously, he has worked as a general manager of Tadwir, a waste recycling company. He was program manager with CHF International, head of operations in Iraq, rehabilitation programs. He is the key founder of Environmental Quality Authority, the Birzeit University Community Health Unit, and an environmental audit company in the United Arab Emirates. Mohammad led the Palestinian team in the environmental negotiations under the Middle East peace process and led the joint Palestinian and Israeli environmental experts team. He worked as a water and environmental expert with local NGOs, governmental institutions, donors in the private sectors, and academic institutions. With his accumulated experience in infrastructure programs, water and environment, rehabilitation programs, humanitarian aid programs, governance, food security, emergency response, as well as educational programs, he is uniquely qualified to share his expert view on the report and maybe also ways forward from the report. We are glad to have you, Mohammad. Please, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon, good morning to all. I'm really grateful to be given this chance to be with you today, and was lucky to be one of the participants in the 2017 preparatory meeting for this report. From practitioner point of view, I would say that although crises should be exceptional circumstances, but sad enough, one feature of protracted crisis in some localities and locations around the Middle East is that they are progressively becoming normalized. Therefore, the timing of this report is really very essential. At the same time, having the report with joint forces from three key participants in terms of ICRC, World Bank, and UNICEF, it gives the report additional strength. It's true the report has listed a number of challenges before and after, but these are not all. And I'm sure that practitioners around the Middle East, even anywhere in the world, would think of a long list of challenges that might be faced during crisis. One of these, as we have faced recently in Gaza crisis, is the need for immediate need for data and data accuracy. One of the issues that we have thought of carefully, and I'm sure that in other countries around the Middle East, is there any really political agenda hidden behind any interventions, and how to avoid politicizing interventions, which can be really a killer. At the same time, one of the issues which was raised, what standards are we looking for in meeting the challenges and meeting the demands of the communities under crisis? Should we go to normal standards that we have thought of in normal cases, or should we set a set of new standards that we can work with, as long as that does not really affect health or environment or lives? One of the issues that are always faced is not only the shortages of cash flow at the sales provision, but at the same time, there are usually lots of commitments, but the allocations are limited. And I'm sure we have faced that, and others have faced that. The role of the local communities sometimes is really not given enough attention. But at the same time, one might think of temporary solutions for some of the challenges. One of the issues that we have faced in Iraq, in Syria, in Palestine, even in Libya, that we don't think good enough on the long-term social environmental impact of these short-term alternatives or solutions, and that is to be given enough attention. Should one think of humanitarian governance standards or indicators is another issue that as a practitioner we have thought of. But one of the issues that we have faced and currently facing, the gender role, it is sometimes really missed during crisis, and as if men leads the interventions and the thinking and the planning, which is not the proper solution. In short, this report is a good tool, followed by localized action plans. I'm sure it can save lives under crisis, it can save resources, and it can save time. I'm looking forward to see localized versions of the action plans to be associated with this report. And again, Palestine would be more than willing to be one of those pilots, if there is a pilot, to test the recommendations and actions given in that report. I leave the rest for next round of talks. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Mohammad, for pointing out already those very important points pertinent to the discussion and to take things further. I would now like to introduce Rodrigo Mena. He is Assistant Professor of Humanitarian Aid and Disaster Governance at the Institute of Social Science of Erasmus University in Rotterdam. His research focuses on humanitarian aid responses and risk reduction to disasters and their interaction and the nexus with other crises, such as social conflict, climate change, and migration. Dr. Mena also serves as a board member of the International Humanitarian Studies Association and as a convener of the Peace and Ecology Commission at the International Peace Research Association. Before his current positions, he has worked as a consultant, as a researcher, and as a project manager with local and international NGOs, the United Nations, and ministries, particularly in disaster and conflict-affected contexts such as Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Chile, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, and Yemen. So we are very glad to have you, and also, you know, this very wide range of perspectives to contribute to this panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Andrea, for the invitation. Hello, everyone. Just initial thoughts from the academic perspective, that was what I invited to say at the beginning. I need to be honest that actually the academic perspective is still in development. I mean, there is still too much, or we still have to research much more about this. But still there is something that we have learned in the past. And one of the things that we have learned, particularly having an historical perspective, is that the ideas of the triple nexus or the humanitarian development nexus are not new. I mean, we had already in the 80s, actually, the linking relief, rehabilitation and development approaches, the RRD as it was called. Later on the 90s, we have the so-called smart relief, promoting ways in which humanitarian aid, can be more developmental oriented. So this is something that has been already evolving for more than 40, 50 years. And lastly, as we know, we had the new way of working that actually from the World Humanitarian Summit that brought back these ideas with the idea of the triple nexus. However, there is some important differences that we have now with the triple nexus. And one of them is that for the first time, this is just more like a global agenda. It's not only an agenda from one sector. For the first time, they have more donors on board of the idea also and promoting it. We have more projects implementing and piloting these ideas, but also we have other realities pushing the agenda, like mass displacement or migration, climate change, and others. So what we have learned so far from these agendas in the past, or these ideas, is that although the label might change, RRD, smart relief, triple nexus, there are things that keeps coming all the time. And one of them is the need to have a better clarity on the terminology, particularly on the peace building part, or what the P stands for. Is it really about peace? It's about peace building? It's about conflict sensitivity, conflict risk reduction, or others? So there is a lot of confusion. And when you start working on this, when you start interviewing people, you realize that you just ask them, what the P stands for. And by the definition that they give you, you realize they are talking actually about conflict resolution or conflict risk reduction or do no harm and other many terms. So there's important clarity. And this also comes from the report back in the days in the 90s and the 80s. Also, the translation of the idea of the triple nexus, because everyone seems to be, yeah, this is really amazing. We want to do it like the localization idea also. But in reality, how to translate that into practical terms is super difficult because there is no much policy document. There is no much guiding document informing about the operational or financial aspect or mechanisms for it. So we need more reports actually as the one that we are reading now that can teach us and inform us better what is happening. The other important thing that we have learned so far, that the need to meet people's immediate needs is important. So we need to have these long-term solutions, but we also need to support people in their needs today. In this case, and the reports show up clearly the water and sanitation needs of them. So we need particular set of skills, really technical one, but we also need people with the capacity to have an overarching approach. And that's super complicated because something that we also have learned, and as Dr. Mohammad said, long-term impacts, the long-term impacts of short-term solutions. So we need to be careful always about that. And the final point that we have learned historically is that conflict and governance, or governance structures, or to be honest, in these places or many places, the lack of governance structures matters. Conflict and governance structure matters first on a temporal dimension, particularly the temporal dimension of conflict, as we were saying before, the protracted sense of conflict, how conflict ends and starts. But also we need to understand that different governance arrangements bring onto the table different aid systems and different aid-state relationships. We know that humanitarian aid actors have a particular way of relating with states and authorities, and development actors have a different one. How are we going to balance those ones when they start working together is one of the main challenges that have not been solved in the last decades. There are other new challenges on top of this one that we mentioned now, new learnings that also Michael mentioned before, but maybe we can talk more about later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, for your comments. They are very much in tune with our own experience here at the Center for Humanitarian Action and our research on the so-called triple nexus. It resonates with us and the challenges that we have also faced. So let's now start the discussion on two specific aspects. In our preparation sessions to this event, we have identified several aspects pertinent to the conclusion of the report. We would like to touch upon two of them now. One of them is the temporal dimension that has been pointed out already by the speakers, related to the concurring project logic of international aid assistance, for example. So when talking about the temporal dimension, in your view, get a little bit more into detail and practice. What is needed and can be done before those crises actually turn into what we now have learned are protracted crises? And also with regards to NEXUS ideas, what forms of lasting coordination mechanisms, like beyond short-term coordination mechanisms between different sets of actors, may they be purely humanitarian development, double mandate, or government and donor actors, are needed to create what Mohammad has also called a minimal preparedness. And maybe if you would like to speak to that also, what in your view from an academic perspective, researcher's perspective, but also from a very practical perspective, what factors currently do hinder those levels of coordination at the moment? This is like the first round of thoughts and questions I would like to feed into the discussion. And who would like to take the ball?
I can start.
Great.
Well, look, in the Middle East, again, sad enough, everybody should not assume that we are fully protected against crisis. Sad enough. Therefore, preparedness in terms of identification of potential impacts, regardless being short-term, long-term, is a must. So that's on the one hand. That assumption is that crisis might happen. That can be natural, can be accidental, can be security, can be civilians. We are used to that. And to be prepared for that in terms of what potential impacts can be there, what potential positive impacts, if there is any, and how can we enhance those, and what negative impacts, which are mostly that we can mitigate in the future, what measures can we have in place, what responsibilities, what resources should we allocate, again, what sort of coordination should we look into, clear roles and responsibilities. And unless these coordinations, mechanisms, and communications are published, people might forget about them. So we should set a set of coordination mechanisms, and they should be published. So it's not every time that we are going through crisis that we start thinking who is to do what. No, that should be published beforehand. In terms of logistical preparedness, it's true that some service providers, their financial resources may not allow, but at least, as you said, minimal preparedness in terms of spare parts, standby generators, financial resource to be allocated and not to be touched at all during normal situation, but to be kept for potential crisis. What capacities should we have in terms of our teams, our staff? If at all possible, can we have some stored water somewhere with different quantities, different qualities that can be used? And again, it's true that there might be energy collapse and sewage pumps may not work, waste may not be collected. Can we allocate a designated area, but to make sure that the long-term impacts are well studied? If these can be thought of and put in writing and paper, all plans should be tested on regular basis from time to time. We should not only have emergency plan or preparedness plan, but these plans should be tested from time to time, assuming that crisis might come through, sad enough. And just like the army, test your plans from time to time to be prepared and not to be surprised by any crisis, given the fact that in the Middle East, crises are almost normal. And to avoid normalizing crisis, we should be prepared to tackle those crises once happened. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Mohammad. I think you already pointed out very specific and pertinent questions and challenges. Actually, I really like how you pointed out the lack of accessibility of knowledge and data sharing, which is, I think, something that most organizations have to work on a little bit better, and also, living up to one's own standards also in the context of testing and monitoring. I really appreciate and like that. Rodrigo or Michael, you have already unmuted. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think what Mohammad was saying, and also the report is quite clear. And what is also known in the literature is that protracted crisis invited at least two types of discussion, many more. But two that are key is one is how to sustain effort on the long run. And is it possible to do it? And what is clear from the report and also what we saw before with Engineer Khaled, that it's not possible. So how do we do it? How we sustain effort that is still we need to sustain somehow? So one is like to the front view. But the other question that is really important when we talk about protracted crises is also what can be done before the protracted crisis, what can be done in advance to prevent to happen. And that was quite clear also in Dominick's presentation. And the main question also is it possible to do something? And that's the question that a lot of people keep asking, how is it possible to really foresee things that will happen or not? Especially, it's important to understand that most research say that most crises start before the crisis. It's because there is root causes of it, poverty, vulnerability, inequality. So there are many indicators that we can start observing. Recent research that we also conducted, for example, in Afghanistan on the implementation of disaster risk reduction measures, particularly in conflict settings, but in this case in Afghanistan, also showed that it's possible. It's possible to do disaster risk reduction in Afghanistan. Also research in South Sudan and other places show the same. But we also need to understand that all these pre-measures will be limited in terms of the depth of them, their territoriality, or how much territory they can cover, but also the impact of them. And also in line with what Mohammad was saying before is we need to also understand another way of approaching of what to do in advance is not only thinking in the humanitarian development nexus, but it's what, I don't know how to call it, I don't know why we have this tendency to label things sometimes in academia, the reversed, the other nexus, but there is really few research about this. I just did a research project on this on Yemen, and it's the development to humanitarian aid nexus, the other one. So we have many places like Syria, Yemen, and many other that they were having a lot of development money and actors and projects happening before the actual crises. And then everything turned into the crisis, the civil war that we know now, humanitarian actors came in. How we link both? What happened with those actors? What happened with those projects, with all those expertises on the ground? And how much that knowledge was transferred or not? What happened with those money? Projects that were financed for 7, 8 years, 5 years, really rare in humanitarian action, where went, all these projects? So this other nexus is something that there's no much discussion about it, the development to humanitarian one. So we have a recent publication about this. It was coming out. I won't talk much about it, but it's also important to start asking this other question: how we not only look forward, but also how we link with previous effort. Where did all this expertise went? And this is really important to really see it. To start reading the signals and to share them in advance, because development actors were there for a reason, and they most of the time they see what things, that things are evolving, and they see that things might go really south. But when I have been interviewing and also researching these and working on this, most of the time there is not much transference of this information or these red flags pointed out to humanitarian actors, and there is no also system in the humanitarian sector to really pick up these red flags. So how we advance also in this system approach to crises.
Yeah, really interesting point also with regards to that you pointed out that not only the intervention themselves have the reputation and the practice of being siloed, but also the discussion about this is siloed, about the different nexus that we have. So before I would like to open the discussion to the audience, I would give Michael and maybe also Dominick the chance to connect to what has been said in this first round on the temporal dimension and the needs.
From my side and from a humanitarian, I think, practitioner's perspective, this report goes a long ways in addressing the last thing that Rod really mentioned. And that's really a need to learn together, a need to learn from practice together, both humanitarian and development actors. And the question that you raised, Andrea, in terms of the temporal dimension and what can we actually do in practice? Well, Gaza provides certain insights that are unique in a way, primarily because there has been these 4 sadly, wars that have taken place with periods of time in between that have allowed both development and humanitarian actors to engage. And some of the important things that we need to learn from those previous experiences, we've learned after 2014, for instance, that it's obviously not enough to have one warehouse for spare parts and consumables in Gaza City to serve the whole of the Gaza Strip. And so the ICRC was instrumental in supporting the CMWU and the water and wastewater departments in ensuring the pre-positioning of not only facilities for quick dispatch, but also the spare parts and consumables then in all 5 governorates. We need to look at pre-crisis also working with development actors to have a spatial development infrastructure that's set up. One of the key principles behind emergency preparedness and response is being able to work off the same sheet, being able to work with the same data. There needs to be that kind of transparency. Development actors could do much more in terms of engaging humanitarian actors earlier when, for instance, the onset of a crisis actually occurs, in terms of being able to provide asset inventories to increase the ability for us to be able to have that intimate understanding of the systems quicker. Building in redundancies, instead of continuing to build back infrastructure, we need to also build resilient systems and resilient services. And we can see that, for instance, in Gaza and in Syria, where the ICRC has worked on second and direct power supply lines to provide the flexibility, for instance, of electrical service providers to prioritize electricity supply for critical water, wastewater, and health-related installations, instead of simply relying just on generators that all of us know can be prohibitively expensive. And if you can't get the fuel to them, then they don't function. We need to think about issues around safe to fail. That's not to say that safe to fail means we can ensure access to pre-crisis levels of service delivery. What it means is that at least a minimum level of service delivery is provided to the population to mitigate humanitarian consequences, in particular that relates to public health. And so at least 50 liters per capita per day over time, in terms of being able to switch the level of health concern to low. And then to build finally on something that I think was highly relevant, that was mentioned before by Rod. Humanitarian actors are so used to applying the do no harm rule to our emergency responses, to our short-term responses. The more we get involved in longer-term responses, which we can see from contexts like Syria, where the ICRC has invested millions and millions of Swiss francs in support, that's longer-term support to service providers, and so is UNICEF. We need to also apply the do no harm rule to that longer term response. And that's where it's so critical to have professional insights from development actors that might have been there decades before the onset of the conflict. They can help provide what is the best available data and information, potentially, as well as expert advice. And you can see that from situations like Aleppo. When El Hafsa water treatment plant failed, the emergency preparedness plan that UNICEF ICRC supported with the Aleppo Water and Sanitation Authority at the center of it was to re-equip and drill over 120 wells in the city and provide an online platform for people to know where they can go to get water if they don't have water in their taps. And hence the question then becomes, how long can you run that alternative network before you do irreparable damage to the groundwater? And that's something that you cannot do a hydrogeological assessment during the heat of battle in Aleppo, but it is something where we could leverage some of the best available expertise from organizations, for instance, like BGR in Germany, to help inform these responses and imply do no harm on the long run. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I think already anticipating what we hopefully discuss a little bit later by pointing out that the do no harm rule is through the do no harm rule connecting a temporal dimension with a conflict dimension that we hopefully get into a little bit later as well. Dominic, the floor is yours. Before you start, please, dear audience, feel free to post questions and comments. After Dominic's input, we will open up the floor with my colleague, Sonja.
Very quick point from me. Rod, I'm very encouraged that there is an academic debate about this development to humanitarian rather than the other way around, because I really felt that we were going out on a limb when we started to discuss this in the report. And I would even go to say that there was some, not hostility, but there was some questioning of this in the development community. Why are you talking about this? Why bring in humanitarian actors into to discuss our business, if you like? Yeah, fine. It's fine that we tell them what to do, but not so fine that they tell us what to do. And I think this is a really key thing, and I think there's a lot of mileage in it. Thank you. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Dominic. So, dear Sonja, please get on stage.
Many thanks, Andrea. Indeed, the chat has been very lively, and I would like to take this opportunity to raise two very interesting questions to our very distinguished panelists today. The first question is indeed from Robert Bircher, who works with the ICRC, and his question touches upon a thing that the panel has already discussed a little bit, which is with regard to the consecutive phases of crisis and how to distinguish between them. So his question is posed directly to Dominic. I fully agree to improve on the humanitarian and development nexus. What does this mean in protracted conflict contexts? Is there an early post-crisis? Taking Gaza, for example, post-crisis is before the next crisis. Don't we need development thinking as a permanent intervention feature? So as I said, touching a bit upon this consecutive phases of crisis, and I think the panel has already talked a bit about that. The second question, also a very interesting question, comes from Matthias Roach. He asks about knowledge management and the sharing of information between different stakeholders. So specifically, his question is how to address the specific problems of knowledge and experience consolidation for resilient systems when privatization of public services is broadly implemented, meaning splitting knowledge and experience between a lot of stakeholders. So we have private companies, public services, development agencies, and so on. So many communications lines that are susceptible to break down in a conflict or a disaster. So how does the panel feel about that? And lastly, as Andrea already said, we received a commentary from Freddie Liesner from MSF beforehand, so yesterday, and they asked if they could comment on some aspects of the report. For that, I will also shortly ask Freddie to the stage so that he can raise 2 or perhaps 3 issues that he'd like to comment. Once we'll have that, then I would ask all the panelists to comment on the 2 questions regarding knowledge management as well as the consecutive phases of crisis. With that, Freddie, I'd like to ask you to the stage. Perhaps you can turn on your video and audio if that's possible.
Hi, just
Excellent.
checking that you can hear me all right.
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Great.
Then the stage is yours.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thanks very much for giving us this opportunity to comment on this extremely important discussion. And thanks to the panel for all of their insights. First thing I think that we'd like to mention is that we at MSF definitely agree with the overall objectives of improving water supply and sanitation in protracted crisis. We agree also with the imperative to see a more robust, resilient, and effective role for development actors in maintaining critical service provision in volatile contexts as well. We also see the need for humanitarian actors to pay attention to the need for sustainable solutions during crisis. However, in doing so, humanitarian actors cannot for one day neglect the emergency service provision, which is in many contexts, unfortunately, still not up to standard. We also feel it's important to emphasize the responsibility of development actors to equip themselves to work in volatile contexts. Mere coordination cannot replace organizational capacity and mindset to maintain proximity to affected communities, even in periods of insecurity. This would maintain critical services and infrastructure that save lives, as well as building trust and the resilience mentioned in affected communities. We feel that international development actors should be encouraged to take on this responsibility themselves, including reassessing their limited appetite for risk. Another key barrier that we've seen to progress is transparency of technical and operational data. The fact is that we need to see better data sharing between the two sectors, and we also need to stop politicizing responses and essential services during crises. And then my final point is that while the humanitarian water and sanitation sector has faced challenges in urban settings, I think that we also need to mention that it has also failed to deliver in a lot of rural and camp contexts as well, where there are no notable access or other conflict-related constraints. For example, recently in Sudan, where Tigrayan refugees are risking their lives to return to Tigray or traveling north to Libya because of the appalling living conditions in camps that have only been opened 6 months ago. So similarly to my point about development actors maintaining proximity to affected communities, these failures by the humanitarian WASH sector are also happening because the capacity of the humanitarian sector is not proximate enough to the affected populations. Nor is it adequately engaging and collaborating with the communities that it serves. We appreciate that this can be challenging, but until it's addressed, then regardless of whether the crisis is protracted or not, rural or urban, whether or not the issue is a technical or an economic one, we don't think that services are likely to improve, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferry, for this very important perspective. Who among the panelists would like to start to respond to those very insightful comments and questions that have been raised in the audience and by Freddie just now? Dominic, you have unmuted and probably you're the best person to respond.
I'd be very happy to, and hi Robert, very nice to hear from you again. So I want to address both Robert and Freddie's points, because I think that this question about phases is just becoming much more blurred. So the idea that in the past, for example, Liberia, Sierra Leone, there were peace settlements. There was a period of really deep crisis and violence, and then you sort of shift into this post-peace settlement phase. I mean, that just isn't relevant to most of the crises that we see around the world today. And so my first point is really there's a complete blurring, if you like, of phases of crisis. And that's why a point I made earlier was, if you're not fighting a fire right now, you're in a pre-crisis phase, which is sort of an odd thing to say, but I really believe it. But linked to that is a second point, which is around the way that financing of development and humanitarian work is also changing. So it used to be streamed very clearly in two separate sort of funnels. But there is also, thankfully, a blurring, but in a good sense, of humanitarian and development financing, but it still needs to go some way. So here's a point that Freddie made. You can't stop delivering humanitarian aid, but the idea should be that there are also development resources so that humanitarian actors can either start working on this transition or very much agree with Freddie's point, development actors need to get much better at equipping themselves to work in volatile contexts. I like the way you put it, and I really think that's important. But to sum up, it's this blurring both of the phases generally. I mean, that's the reality, much more blurred. Thankfully, the financing is becoming blurred, but we also need then the actors, and this is really why the theme of the report, the joining forces, is we can no longer really think in these two silos. We need to go beyond these two silos. Back to you, Andrea.
Andrea, could I add to that?
Sure. Mohammad,
please, no, go ahead.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Michael. Well, look, I like the way it's said, pre-post crisis, and Gaza was given as an example. It's true that the pre-crisis in Gaza for the past 15 years, it's not only the last security escalation, the closure for more than 15 years, the control over resources, the security escalations, all of that made it really impossible for Gazans to be prepared for any new crisis. And when I said normalization, it is as if crises are normal in Gaza. But again, it is the nature of the crisis, not in Gaza, but anywhere. The nature of the crisis make the difference between what sort of interventions, and should we start touching upon developmental plans or not. A short-term crisis, we don't need to look into developmental policies to modify. But in case of Gaza or Syria, I would believe that one should start thinking again of the strategies and developmental plans, if they are the right ones or not. But again, continuous escalations, when it comes natural escalations, security, internal, all of these together make it really impossible for any emergency response plans to be responsive for the magnitude of the crisis that one might face. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you. Michael, please share your thoughts.
Yeah, to build on what Dominique and Mohammad have said, and to address in particular the points by both Robert and Freddie, from the ICRC, we would tend to agree that the relief, rehabilitation, development paradigm no longer represents an integrated transition, but rather activities can occur concurrently and based on the needs and capacities in a given context and at a specific period of time. And Gaza highlights that extremely well, but also in the report, we touch on Yemen, where the World Bank is starting to show signs of being slightly less risk averse and engaging. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to go as far as to have a presence on the ground if the security situation really doesn't allow for it. It's not obviously for a humanitarian organization to say, but what we would say is that there's different options for them to engage before they reach that conclusion as to whether or not they're willing to be on the ground. And there, a good point is that with decades, for instance, of experience in Yemen that mainly the World Bank, KfW and GIZ and the Dutch Development Corporation had, those are the main development agencies that have spent decades in Yemen and are the main ones that hold the same interlocutors at service provider level and at ministry level as do we, the ICRC or UNICEF or other humanitarian organizations that are engaged on this longer term support. And then in terms of Freddie's point, I can't help but think in some ways there's a misunderstanding. The longer term support that we're advocating for in a protracted crisis, again, is not to restore services, but rather to stabilize or at least stem the decline of those services, to protect public health and to mitigate consequences. At the end of the day, the Water and Habitat Unit for the ICRC is a public health engineering unit. We haven't lost our identity overnight. Rather, through a preventative longer-term support that we provide, what we can do is we can prevent the collapse of whole systems, which then allows for emergency responses to continue to be options. Again, I provided that example earlier, but you know, when systems collapse, if you have hundreds of thousands of people that you need to serve, you still need an intact water supply system. You can't simply, in the heat of battle, start drilling wells everywhere. And then the focus on resilience is something that we often find is misunderstood as well. The focus on resilience is, in protracted settings, is to learn from the repeated direct and indirect impacts that lead to failure or that lead to service decline, and find ways to build in resilience building measures. And I alluded to a few before in terms of the direct power supply lines for critical water and wastewater related infrastructure. But really, by strengthening the resilience, you ensure the reinforcement of the ability to have an emergency response that is relevant. So here, I think for humanitarian actors, we couldn't agree more, though, when MSF and Freddie have said that humanitarian principles are the key here, and that's why humanitarian actors need to be still so active on the ground, is to ensure that all of those people, regardless of what side of the conflict line they are on, still have an inclusive and equitable access to services. And to do that and to reach those people, you need to use humanitarian principles. That's not something that development actors are going to be able to do or have an ambition to do.
Rodrigo, would you jump on that? Also, maybe with regards to one question that has been posted in the chat to the triple nexus, the humanitarian development peace nexus, and the question if the do no harm principle might be the minimum standard of coordination. Maybe you could already also speak to that, and after that I will invite Sonja back to the stage for a second very short round of questions that you could connect with your final statements.
Thanks so much. I think that final question you're saying also relates to another question that people were saying about the phases of crisis or conflict. And we need to move forward, beyond the idea of the crisis phases. Usually they are really iterating, and they're iterating in the same crisis. You know, you have regions of the country with less level of conflict and others that more. The other thing that everyone knows working on living, I actually grew up in places with conflict, is that you have pockets of peace or places, you know, in the same countries under conflict that they have less intense levels of conflict, where you can start developing some other, you know, less humanitarian actions. So all this idea that we need to move forward for the idea of the linearity of conflict. The other thing you need to understand, and related to the last point, is that conflict will always be there. So there are different levels of conflict. You have the macro level of conflict between great parties and armed. You can have the meso, but you have the micro, and there always will be conflict in society. You know, there always will be parties disputing, even if it's a really local community level. So the do no harm principle, or the principle of how we learn to deal with differences, is much more important, because that will sustain not only the big agreements, the peace agreements, but also the local agreements that actually they are summing up to the big crises. Another comment was also about the sharing of information, and also that related with coordination. And it's also what also Dominick and others were saying. I mean, we need to understand that there are mandates, and the humanitarian development actors that have the mandates. And what is clear, that humanitarian actors are much more clear on how they coordinate. You know, you have OCHA, you have the pool fund. But when it comes to development actors, it's much more blurring. I mean, who is coordinating whom, which are the funds? And also because they relate with different actors, state actors, they have less, you know, they're less prone also to share information. And something that's important also related to another question or comment of someone is that it's not that development is happening after, or it's not that we need to start really integrating development into humanitarian action. I think it's important to acknowledge that it's already happening a lot of development in the middle and amidst big crises. And this is mainly by local actors, people from those countries who stay there and work and keep working there. So development actually starts much before the international sector saying we're having development. And sometimes they do it in really innovative ways. They are working in NGO, they have fund for something, and they do something that is not, in the log frame, it's out of what they should do, but they know that this is important. They know that in this will sustain long-term changes. So there's much more development happening than the one that we sometimes forget from outside. So we also need to be aware of these nuances. And the final nuance also related with conflict that is always present and all of that all the distinction between humanitarian aid, development aid, after and post-crisis are more from a technical point of view, were useful for the discussion. But people living them, they don't see those differences, They have needs, they have poverty, they need water tomorrow. And they don't care if it is a development actor or, they don't care the donor, they just need services. And for them, crises are prolonged other than the peace agreement. So we also need to have always this like everyday politics and everyday understanding of situations for other people. I try to raise different points of the chats.
You did a great job doing so, very inspiring. And I would love to chat more about this right now, but I will now invite Sonja back to the stage to feed in like maybe a couple of comments and questions that have not been touched upon yet, to then feed it back to the panelists. And I would ask you maybe as the panelists to connect your thoughts on that to a final statement and your wrap-up comment in this session, because we are running out of time.
Yeah, many thanks, Andrea. One question that was raised by Mahmoud also relates to a lot what Rod just said. The question of the egg and hen problem and who takes a lead in coordination. So where is the starting point? Do we look more from the start before crisis, or do we look more during the emergency phase and then look towards a bettering of the situation? So the question is, in protracted crises, which are mostly armed conflicts and is not known when they will stop, should we work to develop water and sanitation system with the emergency response, or should there be an emergency response plan? During that, we work with other actors to develop a more of a long-term plan. And very interesting in that sense was also a comment by Lisa from the German Red Cross, who said that this is indeed a very pertinent point. In Myanmar, they see that during the intensification of the conflict, a lot of the development stakeholders actually left the countries within more or less 3 weeks. So this is also a bit of an issue which links to how present development organizations are in active conflict settings and when they actually return. And then lastly, perhaps, although it's also quite a large question, again from the ICRC, is about the political economy dimensions of service provision in protracted crisis, meaning that we have to understand vested interests, rent seeking, and other dimensions of political economy that could help us steer our interventions, in particular when it comes to strengthening institutions. So perhaps a bit more of a comment to make sure or to ensure that interventions are also considering political economy and their interrelations with their impact on interventions. So I know these are quite large questions, but perhaps since Rod already commented a bit on the first one, we can focus perhaps on the second one. With that, hand back to Andrea.
Thank you. Maybe let's take 5 more minutes. I apologize to the audience for overstretching your time and also to the panelists, but I think now it's always like that, and now we're getting to the heart of things. And I would ask the panelists to for a last statement with regard maybe of what has been said right now. I know political economy is not exactly the best horse to build a 1-minute statement on, but do your best. Who wants? Mohammad, please.
Well, look, the key words in these crises are plan, coordinate, build trust. Trust would be a key issue. And therefore, it should not be only one party who would look into interventions. And because, as was said in one of the questions, the players are so many. They can be public, they can be private, they can be NGOs, they can be developmental partners. Therefore, there has to be an institutionalization of a team who would look into interventions, who would put priorities, and that is to build trust among the team members as well as with the communities. At the same time, because crises may not only hit water and sanitation, but they can be sort of common. Therefore, the team, the national team from all the players should be multi-sectorial. It should not be only water and sanitation expertise, but it should be multi-sectorial. Again, as long as you have trust, you have coordination, I'm sure the mitigation and implementation of the mitigation measures can be useful and can show fruitful outcomes. Again, it was great being with you, and I'm looking forward for localization of the recommendations of the report in Palestine in not crisis, but normal situation. Thank you.
Michael, would you like to follow up?
Yes, my concluding remarks somewhat go to address Mahmoud's question, but also the other question. I think, you know, pre-crisis development actors need to do much more to support service providers in developing emergency preparedness plans. Almost all of the surveys that we did with all of the utilities across those 7 contexts, a vast majority of them did not have an emergency preparedness plan. Humanitarian actors can provide insight into that from extensive experience in protracted conflicts, especially those that have for years or decades provided this longer term support to service providers, as UNICEF and ICRC has. I think when we look at the type of opportunities we have in front of us in terms of a stronger collaboration between humanitarian development actors, we need to leverage the comparative advantages that we have, those distinctively different comparative advantages that we have, and still yet respect our mandates. And to do that, we don't only look at reallocations of financing, but we also look at what we've been talking about and what the report focuses on: knowledge and expertise exchange, operational collaboration, but also the potential to really shape the policy-related debate, excuse me, on drawing attention to very critical issues, like, for instance, facilities that might be too big to fail. If they fail, you could have millions of people that go without access to services. And to mount a humanitarian response against that would be highly unlikely. Preventative responses are necessary, and we need to think about how to do that together.
Thank you, Michael. Dominick, would you like to follow up?
Very quick point from me, which is that I've noticed that, for example, the IDA deputies, that's the bilaterals and all the countries that sit on the bank board, are very concerned about this and want to see the development actors do much more with humanitarian actors at both ends of the problem, pre-crisis and post-crisis. And my point really here is that ultimately it's taxpayers somewhere who are paying for a lot of this, and it's good that voice is articulated, whether it's through IDA deputies or through bilaterals, through the political mechanisms that there are, to say, look, hey, get rid of these silos, find ways to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rodrigo, the final statement is yours.
Yeah, no really statement, it's just that as much as you learn about this, you realize how complex it is. So my final statement is actually might bring more complexity to it. And it's coming back to the first thing that I said when I was recapitulating the history of the discussion, is that it's new things to consider now, and that also means when there is new actors to consider, and that brings more complexity, I know. But one of them is, what about the localization agenda? It's something that not always comes into here, and we need to do really to start really talking about colonization, decolonization, but also localization agenda seriously. The other one, as I said at the beginning, is climate change. We need to really start talking more about with people on the climate change sector, prevention, pre-action and all of that. And the other ones are disaster people, disaster risk reduction people and all of them, they're all other actors, also every day more related with climate change ones, but they're usually out of these discussions. So it's just, I recognize the complexity, I don't want to make it more complex, but if we keep forgetting this other aspect and these other actors, it will be really difficult to move forward.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I think this is a very fitting final statement. And I would now, as a facilitator, would like to overstep my boundaries and also point out what I have felt were very, very important points that have been made. I really think that working on building up trust to those people that we as humanitarian and development international organization people are working for is trust that is very central to everything connected to what Mohammad has said about the avoiding to normalize crisis, despite the fact that, of course, we have to deal with the fact that crisis will always be there and we have to adapt to it, but still work towards a situation that that creates more well-being to those people that we are with that organizations want to serve. So I'm really enjoyed this discussion, and I really hope that we can take the input that we have heard at the moment, and also by this range of very diverse actors, which I really enjoyed about this panel, having the humanitarian, the development on the ground perspective, the perspective of a researcher, and all the other inspiring comments from the audience, and the chat has been very lively. I really would like to thank first of all the panelists, Michael, Dominick, Mohammad, and Rodrigo, and also Khaled from Syria, who provided the video, for their participation. Very heartfelt thank you. I think we have learned a lot by your insights and inputs. I would like to thank the ICRC as co-host of this event for approaching us and for organizing and going through with us with this event. It has been a pleasure to do so. I would also, last but not least, really share my heartfelt thanks with my colleagues at the Center for Humanitarian Action, mainly Sonja Hövelmann, who has been monitoring the chat, and Arvid Ratzai, who has done all the technical checkups and issues and has dealt with them in such a professional way. Thank you so much. For everyone, don't hesitate to contact us or each of the panelists. I'm sure you will be happy to also answer further questions. The event was recorded and will be updated on our website in a short amount of time. And yes, thank you so much. I've learned a lot. I hope you have also learned a lot, and I hope we can take this discussion further and see each other again in this or in other contexts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea.
Thank you,
for inviting the organization and for everyone.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. Thanks to all.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you all. Thank you.